There is a piece of financial advice so widely repeated that it has achieved the status of received wisdom. Build an emergency fund. Keep 3 to 6 months of expenses in cash. The guidance is sensible on its surface, and for most people, following it feels like a meaningful act of financial responsibility. The problem is not that the advice is wrong. The problem is that it is imprecise in ways that matter, and imprecision in a safety structure does not reveal itself until the structure is tested. The 3 to 6 month rule originated as a heuristic, a rough approximation designed for general application across a broad population. Like most generalizations, it captures something real while obscuring something important. What it captures is the basic principle that liquid reserves function as a buffer between disruption and financial damage. What it obscures is that the appropriate size of that buffer is not a fixed quantity. It is a function of several variables that differ substantially from one individual to the next, and the range between the lower and upper bound of that rule is wide enough to be meaningfully different in practice. A professional with stable salaried employment, low fixed obligations at a secondary income source has a fundamentally different risk profile than a professional with variable commission-based compensation, a mortgage, a car loan, and dependents. Telling both to hold 3 to 6 months of expenses treats the question as settled when the analytical work has barely begun. The first structural dynamic worth examining is income volatility. Not all income is equally reliable, and the distinction has direct consequences for how much liquid capital a household needs to hold. A salaried employee with contractual income and institutional employment protections faces a categorically different disruption scenario than a freelancer, a contractor, or someone whose total compensation includes a meaningful bonus component. For the latter group, income does not simply stop in a crisis, it becomes unpredictable before it stops, which means the period of financial strain begins earlier and extends longer than a clean job loss scenario would suggest. An emergency fund calibrated to 2 average monthly expenses provides no meaningful protection when income has been reduced by 40% for 3 months before the formal disruption occurs. The calculation has to account for the trajectory of income risk, not just the terminal event. This connects directly to the second mechanism, which is fixed obligation density. The conventional 3 to 6 month framework references expenses, but expenses are not a monolithic category. There is a structural difference between discretionary expenditure, which adjusts in a genuine emergency, and contractual obligations, which do not. A mortgage payment, a lease agreement, a car financing contract, a minimum credit card payment, these continue regardless of income status. They are not expenses that can be deferred through behavioral adjustment. They are obligations with legal and credit consequences attached to non-payment. A household with high fixed obligation density needs a reserve that is calibrated to those obligations specifically, not to a blended average of all monthly spending. A 6-month reserve calculated on total expenses may still be insufficient if the majority of that spending is fixed, because the assumption embedded in the calculation that expenditure can be compressed in an emergency does not hold when the obligations are contractual. The third dynamic is recovery time asymmetry. Most emergency fund frameworks implicitly assume a relatively short disruption, followed by a return to prior income levels. That assumption reflects a particular labor market environment that does not apply uniformly across sectors, roles, or economic cycles. A professional in a specialized field with a narrow job market, or in an industry experiencing structural contraction, may face a recovery period that extends well beyond 6 months. And crucially, the financial damage incurred during an underfunded emergency, the debt accumulated, the assets liquidated, the credit profile affected, does not reset when income resumes. It compounds. An emergency fund that runs out at month 4 in a 7-month recovery does not simply fail to cover the gap, it creates a new financial problem that the returning income then has to address, often at the cost of the capital allocation that was suspended during the emergency. The structural implication is that the cost of underfunding a reserve is not linear, it is multiplicative. The framework that follows from this analysis begins with a recalibration of the baseline figure. Rather than starting from total monthly expenses, the more structurally defensible approach is to calculate minimum fixed obligations, housing, debt service, essential utilities, core insurance, and treat that figure as the floor of the calculation. This is the irreducible monthly expenditure that cannot be adjusted without triggering a secondary financial consequence. From that floor, the multiplier, the number of months, should reflect income stability, not a generic range. A professional with stable contractual income and low fixed obligation density may be adequately protected at 4 months of fixed obligations. A professional with variable income, high fixed commitments, and a narrow employment market should be working toward 9 to 12 months, calibrated to the realistic timeline of income recovery in their specific sector. The implementation mistake here is anchoring to the conventional range out of familiarity and treating the exercise as complete once any figure within that range is reached. The second component of the framework concerns the account structure itself. An emergency fund held in a standard current account or low-yield savings product is not a neutral decision. It is a decision to accept inflation erosion on a meaningful pool of capital, often indefinitely. High-yield savings accounts, money market funds, and short-duration instruments offer materially better return on liquid capital without introducing the liquidity constraints that would disqualify them from emergency use. The structural improvement is not dramatic in the short term, but over a multi-year period, it is the difference between a reserve that maintains its real value and one that quietly deteriorates. The implementation mistake is conflating accessibility with account type, assuming that only a standard savings account qualifies as genuinely liquid, when the practical difference in access time between a current account and a high-yield savings vehicle is measured in hours, not weeks. The third component is a scheduled review cadence. An emergency fund is not a static asset. The appropriate size changes as income changes, as fixed obligations are added or removed, and as employment circumstances evolve. A reserve calibrated to a professional's financial profile at 28 is not automatically appropriate at 35, particularly if a mortgage, a second vehicle, or a dependent has been added to the picture. Most professionals set a figure, reach it, and deprioritize the question. The structural error is treating the fund as a problem that was solved, rather than a variable that requires periodic recalibration. A once-yearly review of the underlying assumptions, income stability, fixed obligation load, sector employment conditions, is a minimum standard for maintaining structural adequacy. What distinguishes financially intelligent professionals in this context is not that they save more aggressively or exhibit greater discipline, it is that they understand their emergency fund as a structural instrument with a specific function, rather than a moral signifier of financial responsibility. They do not ask whether they have followed the standard advice. They ask whether their reserve is appropriately sized for their specific risk profile, held in a vehicle that preserves its real value, and reviewed against changing circumstances. That reframing, from compliance with a heuristic to calibration against a personal risk architecture, is the difference between a reserve that performs its function and one that merely appears to. The 3 to 6 month rule did not fail anyone through malice. It failed through over-application. A general guideline applied without structural analysis is not financial planning, it is the appearance of financial planning. And in the one moment when the distinction matters most, the appearance offers very little protection. If this changed how you evaluate your emergency fund structure, consider subscribing.